go over time. How long should I go to?
5:15.
5:15. Okay.
So we usually end a bit after 5 to have a little time for
Okay,
questions.
good, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. What I'm going to talk to you about is some work that I recently started in crowdsourcing. And this is a very popular term. You've heard it. There's a lot of buzz about it. But I want to convince you today that actually there's some interesting new research issues in crowdsourcing that people in databases can start working on. So this is work that I started with Tova Milo at Tel Aviv University last year when I was on sabbatical there. So how did crowdsourcing come to be such a popular subject that it's so much in the news? Well, it's sort of the confluence of two things. First of all, data is absolutely everywhere. You have web pages, sensor data, satellite images. Everything is coming at tremendous rates right now. And at the same time, you want to be able to get information out of this data. That is, the data itself isn't maybe that interesting, but it's the key to scientific discovery and other things, as you know from things like the Human Brain Project and other sort of interdisciplinary types of activities. But you know, it's not as if we have enough data. Sometimes you actually need more to be able to get the information out of it. And so that's where people come in. Turns out people are also always online, and I'm very impressed that I don't see any open laptops here. I see a few devices that are being held in red, but everybody's online all the time, anywhere in the world. And so that's how crowdsourcing has really come about. We have all sorts of very popular examples from Wikipedia, which you've all used, TripAdvisor, which I'm using heavily here now that I'm new in Lausanne. And there's also sort of citizen science types of activities like Foldit and Galaxy Zoo, where you're bringing the scientific community together to solve science problems. And many of these are based on their own platforms that have been developed, but increasingly people for faster turnaround time are turning to some of the platforms that have been developed specifically for crowdsourcing, like Amazon Mechanical Turk and others. Now, one thing that goes through my mind whenever I start learning about crowdsourcing is, why would anybody spend their time doing it? You know, personally, I'm not the type of person who likes to sit in front of a computer interacting with these types of things, but there's really a couple motivators. Altruism, citizen science, you're solving medical problems. Fun, a lot of the things are structured as games and you get points for the answers that you contribute. And increasingly with platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, you see that you get paid for it. And so people are being motivated to give their time for these types of applications. But there's some problems, and there's articles that have been published in popular places about the issues and how much spam and junk there is that's available through these crowdsourced types of applications. So as we go through the talk, we're really going to keep that in mind, that this is a tremendous resource, but there's also the tremendous potential for junk. So just to keep you awake, I know it's 4:30 in the afternoon and this is a tired time of day for some of us. There's going to be a movie halfway through, and so if you fall asleep in the first little bit, I know that you will wake up for the movie. So the structure of my talk is I'm going to tell you a little bit some of the initial solutions that the database community adopted towards crowdsourcing, and Tim Kraska, who is one of the leaders in this, calls it plopping a database on top of a crowd. And I very much like that expression, so this is not intended to denigrate the work at Berkeley or MIT or other places. But then I think we can actually go further in mining the crowd. And here the flavor is really getting interesting personal information out of the crowd. So we'll go further and talk about mining the crowd. And then, as Natasha said, I've done a lot of work in provenance, and you know provenance is really important in crowdsourcing applications, and there's some new twists that are pretty exciting. So I'll try to tell you about some of those challenges. So the initial solutions, plopping a database on top of a crowd. What are the unifying principles behind crowdsourcing? So the goal is to be able to take some task, which is well defined, and send it out to some group of users. And what kinds of tasks are these? Well, they're things that you can't easily do in a computer, either because you can't yet do it, you can do it better with humans, whatever. And an example of this, and I say this with some trepidation knowing I have somebody from image recognition in the room, an example of this could be you pose a picture to a person and ask, is this a picture of a woman or a man? That people might be able to do that better than image processing techniques. Or two pictures of people, which picture is older? So humans have some sort of intuition that haven't yet been captured very, very well in computers. And so we can think of this as extending some existing database of knowledge. So the original plopping a database on top of a crowd, the architectures look like the classical database architecture to your left in this picture. And then on the right, when you have a query that comes in that is part of it is being accessing the disk and using the traditional database stack, another part of it is going to ship off tasks to the crowd. And this HIT, human interaction task, is a word that's bandied about. This is the small tasks that are sent out to users. As an example of this, the Kirk project at MIT said that there's going to be user-defined functions that you can create. So as an example, suppose you have a relation of people and photos and you want to figure out which of these are women. You can write a user-defined function which would say, given a name and a photo, you're going to ask, is this person female? And they can answer yes or no. And then in a regular query over that relation in the database, you can select the names of women in this. And this would, at runtime, issue this human interaction task out to the crowd. And then they will be clicking yes or no. As an extension of these types of ideas, CrowdDB project at Berkeley also used this idea of an SQL extended type system. But here, the main idea was they wanted to crowdsource the generation of information, whether it's new tuple in a table or a new value in a table. And this is because people in general, they think, are very good at finding data. So they can go out and get the information and help enter it into the database. But the interesting thing in this approach is that the closed world assumption, that is the assumption that everything is true, that is true, is in your database, no longer holds. And so this is going to lead to some very interesting questions. Just to show you an example, you can declare either a table, a relation in a database, or an attribute of a relation as crowd. What that means is that they're going to start out empty initially. So initially the crowd URL here will be empty and this table would be empty. But then you're going to progressively populate it as people start querying the database. So crowdsourcing is a side effect of query processing. So if I were to say select the URL from department where name is math, you come in, you'd execute that over this table. If the URL has already been filled in, then you're okay. You can just send the answer back to the user. But if it hasn't, this is going to generate human interaction tasks. It's going to ship it out to some number of users. And what number of users is a good question because you have to take this the spam into account and make sure you get a good answer. And then it would put the answer back into the table. A more interesting question is, what if I were to say select star from professor? How do I know when I have enough, right? Here we're lucky because there's actually a foreign key over to table. So at least you do it until you know about professors of all of the universities you know about. How many professors are there at a university? How do you know when you have enough? So this is a very interesting problem that actually goes back to species estimation problem in biology, where you have a desert island, you want to know what are all the types of animals that live on the island, and you set a trap, you catch animals, and you keep going until you start not seeing a whole lot of new different types of animals. Sort of like popping popcorn in a microwave. When's it done? When it stops popping frequently enough. So this open world assumption is a very interesting problem. Other issues are contradictions. People say different things. How do you know what the right answer is? And then the optimization problems become very interesting because you're not just doing your traditional database optimizations, but you really need to take into account the cost of each of these human interaction tasks, and you may have a budget or you may want to keep your costs down. So there's some really, really interesting optimization problems within the context of crowdsourcing. And let me just say, if you have any questions at any point in time, feel free to ask. Okay, but fundamental problem is, can you trust the crowd? As that article said, there's a lot of spam out there. So always, always keep in mind that the crowd is a problem. Okay, so those were the initial solutions to this idea of using the crowd as a very valuable resource to augment our knowledge. But I think we can do a little bit more. And here, we're going to try to mine the crowd. We're trying to get idea about people's preferences and habits, because this is a tremendous source of information that isn't easily available on the web. So what we want to know are interesting and important facts in some domain, for instance, folk medicine, people's habits. Question is, how do we do this? How can we formalize how we're going to do this? And in particular, what questions should be generating, and we're doing this automatically, and asking to get at these important habits and preferences. So just to give you a concrete example, suppose that you're going to New York and you have a child, and what you want to know is what are some popular activities to do at child-friendly attractions in New York, and then you know the kid is going to get hungry, so you need a nearby restaurant. So Anna, who's going there, wants this answers to this question. So what's she likely to do? Well, currently you can Google, you can search. Actually, I did child-friendly activities in New York, and you'll come back with a number of ideas about child-friendly activities. But how do you know what the good ones are? How do you know what the most relevant ones are? You have to sift through it and create impressions of what's popular. Also, you haven't got information necessarily about a good restaurant nearby. So you can find forums that would address particular aspects of Anna's question, but perhaps not the entire part of her question. And you could post onto a forum to get input, but again, there's a lot of people seem to spend a lot of time on forums, and it's the vociferous ones that you will get information from that might not be representative of the general population. Okay? So there do exist some things that are available today that we could use to answer Anna's questions. But can we do it systematically for all different types of questions? What are platforms or strategies for doing that? And can we do it in a way that we will be able to give some sort of the relevance of the answer to the question? So what Anna really wants to get out of this is suggestions like this. You can go bike riding in Central Park, and afterwards you can eat at Mao's Vegetarian. Tips. You can rent your bikes at the boathouse. Or another suggestion she might be interested in is you can go visit the Bronx Zoo, and then you can eat afterwards at Pine Restaurant. And a tip, well, you could order antipasta at Pine, but skip the dessert and go for ice cream across the street. So this is the type of thing that Anna is interested in hearing about. In Anna's question and in the strategy that we'll be using, there's really two different types of knowledge. There's a general type of knowledge, the ontological or database-like knowledge, that's talking about the names of activities, the types of sports that you can do, the nearness of certain things to certain other things. It's sort of factual information about the world. But there's also personal and probably unrecorded knowledge about people's habits and preferences. Okay, and this is what we're really interested in based on this type of ontological knowledge. So we want to get significant fact sets out of the crowd, things that are done frequently, and this is what we're going to call a fact set, following an RDF type format. So the formal model that we're going to use for both the general and the personal knowledge is based on RDF. And the general knowledge, as I said before, is going to model things like, well, there are activities like feeding a monkey. I have no idea how feeding a monkey got into this ontology, but suffice it to say that my students thought that this was a very good type of activity. There's other activities like basketball and baseball, which are types of ball games, which are sports. And then we have information about particular locations, the Bronx Zoo, Central Park. Central Park is a park. Central Park is nearby Mao's Vegetarian. It's inside New York City and so on. This is all sort of factual knowledge. We're additionally and probably most interested in the personal knowledge of a person. And so I'm showing a picture of one person's experiences. So one person on April 5th went to the Bronx Zoo and ate pasta at Pine. On April 13th, they played basketball in Central Park. And on the 27th of April, they played baseball in Central Park, and we would be modeling these sets of activities using these types of RDF triples. Okay. The problem is, this doesn't actually exist anywhere. It's inside of your head, and I have to go and I have to get it out of your head. And your head might be quite hard to get inside. If you're like me, your memory isn't always so good. So while we're going to model the information about your experiences in the past as each, let's say, occasion is a transaction which is a set of activities, this is hidden. And the only way that we're going to be able to get at it is to ask that person questions. So people in general can't remember details about what they've done in the past. So knowing that on the 27th you fed a monkey at the Bronx Zoo may or may not be on the top of your mind. But you often can answer sort of more general questions. Answer more general questions such as, well, I know that I frequently play basketball in Central Park. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to get at this, or get at the frequency information in this type of model by asking questions. And there's going to be two different types of questions that we're asking. There is going to be concrete questions like, how frequently do you bike in Central Park? To which you might say very frequently. Or specialization questions like, what types of activities do you do in Central Park and how often? To which you might say, I frequently bike in Central Park. And in our system, we're going to use these questions interleavingly. And the reason why we're going to do that is going to be based very much on user experience. So this is another very interesting angle to the whole crowd mining, is you're not just looking at computational efficiency in all of this, you're looking for the user experience as well. In addition to knowing about particular activities, you might also be asking for sets of activities, such as, how often do you an activity in Central Park, and also eat at Mao's Vegetarian. Okay, so we've talked about the knowledge that we have in our database, which can be general and personal. We've talked about how we're going to get at this personal information by asking questions, concrete or specialization questions. So then what do we do? How do we construct the answers to Anna's question? So what we're really looking for are the overall significant fact sets, things that people do frequently. We don't care about the insignificant things. And what we're trying to do is ask that over all of the crowd, but of course the entire world is way too big for us to ask of, even if they would give us answers. And so, as is done in crowdsourcing in general, we're going to ask questions of a set, some sample of the crowd, and then we're going to somehow come up with an answer. And in our system, as in many other crowdsourcing types of applications, we're going to estimate by averaging over this fixed sample size. So we're going to ask for each question that we have, we'll ask, say, 5 to 10 different people, and we'll take the average answer. Another issue that you run into is that there's going to be a lot of stuff that's coming back at various levels of detail. And so we're going to also be careful to return only the most significant, specific significant fact sets. So rather than saying, I frequently go to a park and play basketball, when in fact at Central Park that you go to, I'd give you, I go to Central Park and play basketball. So most specific significant fact sets and averaging over a sample size is the approach that we're going to take. So ideally, how are you going to get this information out of people? You'd have a conversation with them. You'd let them ask you a question in natural language. And that would indeed be the goal ultimately, but we need something precise to start with now, and so we start with a query language. And what does the query language look like? Well, it looks very much like Sparkle. How many of you have heard of Sparkle in this crowd? Okay, so we've got a great database crowd here. So, as you know, this is the query language for RDF, which is the triples that we've been dealing with, which is pretty much the where clause here. It looks like a traditional Sparkle query. And the weird thing is this satisfying clause, which is borrowing more from sort of data mining. So what we're doing is we have variables indicated by the dollar signs. And what these variables are going to be doing is being bound to nodes in our ontological knowledge. It's sort of the vocabulary that we have to work with. From those bindings, the valid bindings, the ones that satisfy this, we're going to construct these types of questions to the crowd, average over what we get back, and if the support from that sample set is high enough, in this case we're just saying 0.4 out of 1, then we would return that as a potential answer, or at least the most specific one. So this query that I've written here is how you would write Anna's query. Anna's a very sophisticated database girl, I guess. But you would write her query here. It's an attraction inside of New York City, which is child-friendly, and we have an activity, and we have a restaurant, which is nearby that attraction. Okay, so any questions on this? It's all fairly standard Sparkle. Yeah.
It's not quite on this. It's like I kind of failed to see how we went from the person's answer to collecting these facts in a searchable repository.
Right. Haven't gotten there yet, which is why I'm
Sorry.
very glad that you
Fine.
missed it so far.
Okay, good.
So far what I have told you is I've told you how I model the general knowledge. I've told you how I model what's inside of your head. I've told you how I'm going to get inside of your head.
Okay.
And I've told you how you're going to ask this question in our structured language. Now I have to tell you how I get the answers more particularly. So this is it. So remember this ontology. I know it's a big one, but the salient things are that baseball is a ball game, which is a sport, which is an activity. Central Park is a park, which is inside New York City. Central Park is nearby Mao's Vegetarian. So those are the types of things that we're going to be reasoning over. And what we're going to be doing is throwing our variable bindings at this ontology, finding the combinations which satisfy that where clause, and then we're going to be generating questions to the crowd. So given a binding which satisfies the where clause, such as this one, X is Central Park, Y is biking, Z is Mao's Vegetarian. If I could open up your head and look at that personal database of yours, then I would do this sort of reasoning over it. I would say, well, how frequently does this person do it? Well, they do it 2 out of 6 times. I'm not caring about just one individual. I need more, so I might need another person. So this person does that combination of biking in Central Park and then going to Mao's Vegetarian 1 out of 2 times. I want a support of 0.4. If I average over 2 out of 6 and 1 out of 2, I come up to 5 out of 12, which is bigger than 0.4. So this variable binding would be one of the answers that I would give back to Anna. You can go biking in Central Park and eat at Mao's Vegetarian. Of course, I can't exactly pry your head open, but I will ask you questions, and then based on your answers of frequently, very frequently, never, I will average over those values, so those would become these. And then I'd figure out if this binding satisfies the threshold. So as an example of something that wouldn't satisfy, here's another binding. X is Central Park, Y is baseball, Z is Mao's Vegetarian. I pry open your head and I see that user 1 does it 1 out of 6 times, user 2 does it 1 out of 2 times. You average over that and you don't get enough support, so this would not be an answer that comes back.
And
in.
who sets the threshold?
The user does in the
Okay,
query
so-
itself, so the threshold is here.
Okay, it's that.
So Anna says, I want to know that people do it often enough. And so the threshold is in the query. And I know this looks very, Anna's going to ask it in natural language. But there's going to be a layer that goes from the natural language to this formal query. Okay, other questions? Yes?
How do you bind the complexity of reasoning with ontologies, and how computational is it?
So this is a very, very interesting question. And I'm going to get to it in a little bit, but there's really 2 parts of the complexity. There's the computational complexity of reasoning over the ontology, and that can be very, very bad. And there's a wonderful paper on it that I can point to you that's been written on that. The second part of the question, or the complexity, is going to be the number of questions you ask of the crowd. The crowd is a very valuable resource, and you don't want to wear it out. And so you don't want to be asking tons and tons of questions. So not only are we going to worry about the computational complexity of finding these bindings and then doing some reasoning that I'll talk about in a minute, but in the end, how many questions are we asking the crowd, and can we keep that down and still come back with answers quickly? Okay, so yes.
So over here, do you have a subsumption relationship? So like
Yes.
you have?
Yes, so think about the bindings. You have the ontology, you have bindings to nodes in the ontology. The ontology has subclasses. And so if we look here, this is a relationship between bindings for X and Y, that is attractions and activities. The most general binding I could do would be at the root of this ontology. There is another binding that I could do to Bronx view as an instance of an attraction, and feeding monkeys, which is an instance of a activity. And so these are all more general instances of this combination of activities. Okay, so you can create this partial order over the assignments of variables. Now, I know that this is interesting to certain types of people, in particular people in programming languages and on that side of the world. As a systems-oriented person, why in the world should I care about this assumption relationship or partial order over the assignments? Because it gives you a lot of power in reducing the number of questions to your crowd. So let me try to motivate this. If I find out that the Bronx Zoo, feeding a monkey at the Bronx Zoo is a very popular activity, then I know that everything which is more general is also popular. That is, there exists a zoo where people feed monkeys a lot. It's more helpful to know that it's the Bronx Zoo where people feed monkeys. So I would like to return this in my answer rather than that. But I know that these are all going to meet or satisfy the significance factor. On the other hand, if I ever find an assignment which is not significant, that is, you do not feed monkeys at a park. Well, at least not in this country, because there aren't monkeys in a park. Maybe you could do that in Asia. You don't feed monkeys at a park. You find that out from asking your users. Then you know that you certainly don't feed monkeys in Central Park. And so from finding insignificant assignments, anything more significant will also be insignificant. Okay, so the joy of this is, suppose that I were lucky enough to guess about the most significant assignments and the place of the insignificant assignments, then I've classified this entire space of bindings just at that envelope. Okay, so if I can guess at these orange things and these dark gray things, I don't have to explore the entire space of variable bindings. Yes?
But doesn't that mean that the ontology already has to be very general? So what happens if you have this ontology, but the most popular answer that comes back is, oh, I'm going to go to the children's theater in Times Square.
Yep.
And this is not currently part neither under your attraction, outdoor activity, or, feed a monkey. So how can I learn things that are not
This is a great question. So what if your ontology doesn't have everything in the entire universe?
Right.
And there's a lot of work that's been done on how do you incrementally update ontologies. And in fact, in the query language, we're also asking for additional relevant stuff. So we allow people to give us additional knowledge, and the question is, how do we then integrate that back into the ontology? We haven't quite done that yet, but it's a great idea. I love it. Other questions? Okay, so if I'm lucky, I can guess, right? But most of the time we aren't that lucky. So as I said, the most significant patterns are these, and they're going to tell me that everything above them are also significant. The minimal insignificant assignments are the things in dark gray, and they're going to knock everything out below them. And so as we get back answers from the crowd, we're going to be eliminating all sorts of variable bindings that we don't have to explore because we know about them already. Okay, so let's get back to the previous question. As I said, there's really two measures of complexity. One is how long does it come to figure out the next question to ask, and that's the computational question. And then the other is, how many questions to the crowd do you have? And for now, I'm just going to focus on the questions to the crowd and not the computational questions. And so you can see that the lower bound for this is just the number of most significant patterns and the insignificant patterns, the orange and the dark gray things. That's the best I could do. If I were lucky and guessed them, that would be the minimal number of questions to the crowd. But we don't know how to do that in general. And so what we do in our evaluation algorithm is we start from a general assignment, and then we make it more significant. We start making it more and more significant until we discover this envelope, this layer. And so the complexity in our system is a blow up over the optimal of the size of the ontology. So if you think about it, you're either going to start at the top of this ontology and go down, which is essentially what we're doing. You could start at the leaves and go up. You could do a binary search. Who knows? But in our approach, we're going to start at the top and we're going to go down. Okay, so why are we doing that? Why don't we do a binary search or something? Well, this is where the user experience comes in. So imagine that you're at a cocktail party, okay? I imagine I'm this person, okay? So you're sitting there and somebody comes along and tries to strike up a conversation with you. And the first question to you is, how often have you climbed Mount McKinley? It's a very strange question to ask, especially if you hate outdoor sports. You wouldn't dream of climbing Mount McKinley. So the cocktail party way of getting information out of people is you start with something very general like, well, do you like to work out? Then if they say yes, then you go and you say, well, what kinds of things do you like to do? That's a specialization question. So we're going to use that sort of approach in generating the questions to the crowd. And I mentioned specialization questions, so let's go back to our cocktail party and this poor lady who is beginning to wonder why she came. And this fellow, having zeroed in on the fact that she actually does do sports in Central Park, although she hasn't climbed Mount McKinley, says, oh, so you do sports in Central Park. Do you downhill ski there? No. Those of you who've been to Central Park know that you don't downhill ski in
But
Central
that is
Park.
rocks there. I mean, it doesn't know you could do it a little bit, right?
Yeah, well, yes.
For children not to start.
You're standing up for this guy? I don't know about that.
Yeah, well,
So this is the very interesting thing about a crowd mining system is it's not just sort of the computational complexity that you're addressing, you're really thinking about the entire user experience as a whole. Okay, so we have to interleave these concrete questions and these specialization questions. So we have, we've designed a system which is based on an ontology. We look at the assignments to the Sparkle query based on the ontology. That generates a bunch of questions, which goes out to the crowd. We get back responses from the crowd. We look at the responses. We figure out what assignments we don't have to look at anymore based on the frequency of things. And then eventually we come back with answers to the user. So the architecture is significantly more complicated than plopping a database on top of a crowd. Okay, so you've been a great audience so far, but I know you have to wake up. So we're going to return to this question of can you trust the crowd? And that's going to motivate the last part of the talk. So
this is for 16,000. Which of these square numbers also happens to be the sum of two smaller square numbers? 16, 25, 36, 49.
he did go to EPFL.
he did not. He did not.
It's hard to do math when it's enough here.
Ryan, take your time, okay? A lot of time.
With one that you have.
It's under a lot of pressure right now. I'm going to ask the audience.
No problem, audience. Ryan really needs your help here.
Should have said
You're ready.
interest.
Vote now.
I know there's a lot that they should have said was a bad question. I agree.
Okay, 50%, I believe it is 16, 30% say 25, and 19 for 36, and just 1% for 49. Check with the air voters in the messenger crowd. 45% of them say 16, 23 for 36, 22 for 25, just 10% for 49. So they both agree, but the number isn't great. And I just want to remind you, Ryan, that you do have other lifelines if you need them, because should you miss it, you would drop down to 1,000. I don't know where your head was at before you asked the audience. Were you leaning toward anything? Can you figure it out based on what you're seeing here?
I'm gonna. I want to go with the audience on this.
Oh, bad move.
He listened to the crowd.
He listened to the crowd. So the crowd makes mistakes, and it's disastrous in some circumstances if you listen to it. So I know that those of the mathematically inclined among us will quibble about the question that was asked of him, but the point of that is really that the crowd makes mistakes. And sometimes you discover that a person has persistently made mistakes, and you need to be able to somehow find out when people are spamming or doing bad things, and then recover your system from that, which motivates the need for provenance. And I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to do this quickly and just give you the flavor of what we think we need in provenance. So you've seen talks on provenance before. I assume it's really the how and the where of data. It's enabling you to answer questions like, how is this data produced by whom? Can I trust the data? That's fundamentally what we are interested in. And can we reproduce the way that this data is done? And so what I'd like to do is just quickly show you what is already being done in crowdsourcing types of applications, and then prod a little bit further at where I think we should be going in the future. So let's look at TripAdvisor and Wikipedia. TripAdvisor, of course, is aggregating reviews and then providing summaries, and Wikipedia keeps extensive information about how pages are edited. So here's a TripAdvisor page for Denali Backcountry Lodge. This is in Alaska. And what it will do is it will give you the traveler ratings in sort of aggregate. Additionally, it will keep the ratings of travelers so that you can go through and you can get a sense of, well, what have people said rather than just the numerical scores. But additionally, when I look at this, I think, well, how do I know if this is a grouchy person who always reviews badly, or if it's an overly optimistic person who always reviews well? And so TripAdvisor does allow you to go in and look at a person, a reviewer, and see how they've behaved in the past. So this is interesting additional information. It's an additional way, I like to think of it as slicing through the provenance information. If you go to Wikipedia, Wikipedia for a particular web page allows you to view the history. If you go to the history, you can see all of the edits that have ever been made to that page, and this can be very big and very long. And so what they do is they allow you to look at statistics. So if you click on that, you get sort of statistical information about the edits to the page, which can also be viewed in chart and all different sorts of forms. Getting back to the issue of cranky people and their contributions to crowdsourcing, if I were to look at the Mount McKinley revision history, I can then drill down and look at a particular user and see the types of things that they've contributed to in the past. And so for Mongo, whoever that is, I can see that they have contributed quite a few things to a number of different pages. Again, what these crowdsourcing applications are doing is giving you the ability to see things from different angles, to get an idea of the quality, perhaps, of the input from the crowd. So what I think the challenges are in crowd data provenance is that since the process of obtaining data can be enormously complex, I'll give you a short example in a minute, and provenance can be absolutely ginormous, we really need a way of summarizing the provenance. And neither of the, well, Wikipedia was giving you the ability to see general statistics, but it's sort of hard-coded into the system. It would be really great if we could come up with ways of summarizing that you could sort of do more on the fly. You could do it according to the way that you would want to see things being summarized. There's also this idea of multidimensional views, the ability to see things from an answer perspective, from a person perspective, perhaps even from the question perspective. There's many different views of provenance that we could see. And most importantly, we need this for maintenance and cleaning because of all the spammers that are out there trying to get that $15,000 out of that poor guy's hands. So very quickly, I'm going to describe an approach that we've started thinking about to doing this. And it's based on the semi-rings notion of provenance that Val Tannen has introduced. How many people remember that work? Okay, Christoph, front row kind of guy. So, glazed eye view to it is that in the system, each tuple in a table can be given a token, a provenance token. And then these tokens are going to be propagated through the queries over those tuples. An example, if you were to join, then the resulting tuple would be a joint use of those tuples, and you would multiply those tokens together. If you were to project, so here I'm projecting onto A and B, this resulting tuple has contributions from 3 different sources here. And so this would be the alternative use of tuples. And so you'd have a plus. And the same would go for union. This can be generalized even to aggregate operations. It was not easy, but they've come up with a way of generating, for example, the sum of salaries here, a provenance expression which would carry in it the values that are being summed. Now, why is this even interesting? The reason it's interesting is that I need to be able to get rid of spammers. And so if I were to discover that this was bad or wrong, I'd like to be able to delete this. And you can see you could delete that by sort of zeroing out the provenance token there. This could be used to profit with crowd provenance. So as an example of a crowdsourcing workflow, suppose we have a movie review aggregator platform where I'm getting in reviews from users for particular movies. So Alice gave Matchpoint a rating of 7, Bob gave it 6, Carol gave it 9, and what the workflow of this system is, for each review it gets, it wants to know, was it an audience member or was it a critic? In either case, we only care if that person has rated enough movies for us already. It's going to be more than 2 movies. And then we're going to aggregate in this sort of movie rating thing that we're constructing the sum of all of the ratings. Using these sort of provenance tokens, we'd come up with this rather big expression, which I know is a bit much for this late in the day, but just this first component of it, the first rating from Alice. Alice is an audience member, and she has contributed 5 reviews so far, so 5 is bigger than 2, and she gave this a rating of 7, and then so on for the others. So in this rather large provenance expression, we've been able to capture a lot about how that data came to be. Why is that even interesting? Well, for instance, if we discover that user 2 is a spammer, you can just map user 2, essentially think of it as mapping that to a 0, which would get rid of this entire sub-expression in my provenance expression, and would enable me to continue with the good spammer, or the good non-spammers, excuse me. So that's one value of keeping that type of information.
But
Yes?
this means that you have to keep a lot more information, right?
Yes.
So you will actually end up using a lot more space. I mean, you are saving on computation, but
It's not so much, it's the ability to know how to revise the answer that you previously had, the sum. So the sum of ratings for that particular movie,
but for each value of sum, you will have to store the entire expression.
you have to,
It's essentially the entire join.
it's big, and there's ways of minimizing provenance too. But you're right, it's provenance gets very, very big. Okay. Now, provenance gets very, very big is a problem, I think, less for the storage system, because that can take quite a bit. I think this is more of a problem for me. I look at that, it gives me a headache. So what I would like to be able to do is to be able to make that smaller according to my interests, right? So I said earlier that there's ways of minimizing provenance in TripAdvisor because they give you statistics. Yeah, well, I may not want that type of statistic. Maybe I want something else. So let me quickly say what I could do. Glazed eye view. This is that nasty provenance expression at the top. I want to be able to concisely represent it as this, which is saying that audience members contributed 16 to the overall score, critics contributed 6. That could be all that I really care about. I can do that dynamically with this idea of mapping annotations into a much, much smaller space of annotations. Okay, so here I would say I don't care about the users or their statistics. I'm just going to get rid of it and say it's 1, no information. I'm going to map every audience member into one token A, every critic into 1 token C. If you apply that mapping to that provenance expression and then you reduce it, you get that. Okay? So you can see that you can personalize this in some sense by stating that mapping and then doing this reduction automatically so that I get back a nice summary that represents what I as a user of that provenance want to see. So I know this is very high level, and in fact that's pretty much as far as we've gotten with the idea. There's a lot of questions about how do you construct these mappings and what's a good mapping versus a bad mapping, and so that's all ongoing research. Okay, So in summary, what I've told you about is I've told you about sort of the initial crowdsourcing applications and what the database sort of approach or contributions to it were. I've then described how we can use, we can go a little bit further to try to mine people to find out their personal experiences and preferences. And then I've gone a little bit further by saying since there's a lot of people who are giving erroneous answers, whose answers you may want to remove later on, and so on, provenance is extremely important and I think is a very ripe area for future research. Okay, so my conclusion is Pablo Picasso once said that computers are useless, they can only give you answers, but I think we've seen that they can also ask us questions. I think the crowd is an incredible resource. It's a really interesting question to think about how you can get more information out of the crowd, but there's a lot of challenges that requires more work. So that's all. So questions. And don't be shy with your questions.
Okay, more questions?
Yes.
Victor. Sir.
Victor or?
You just have more
Victor,
intelligence, so ask your question first.
I was just trying to understand the example that you presented seemed to be a particular class of queries, and I'm wondering whether you have defined sort of the when these types of queries can be answered using these methods. So it seems like you are basically counting the frequency of certain tuples occurring, right? So you define a set of tuples according to the ontology, and then you count how often this happens. Is that the general class, or is it defined somehow differently?
That is the general class, yeah.
So it seems like a lot of things can be modeled by that. I'm just wondering if it has a name and whether there are examples of what cannot be naturally asked using this.
And I guess I guess the short answer is no. I think it's an interesting question. I would wonder if, we have no negation in there, right? So I am not going to ask, I don't think I can ask, tell me something you would never do with your children in New York.
I mean, are there connections with some probabilistic databases or something like that? So you have a set of ground facts and then does frequency translate into some probability?
So, the first part is just sparkle. So whatever the sparkle part is already there. And the second part is just based on what you can do with the first, because from the bindings that we've already gotten, we're just going out and asking these frequency questions of the crowd. So really, I think the power of the language is defined by the variable bindings in the where clause. Yes?
Okay, more basically a philosophical question. So I find the thing about the provenance extremely interesting. But this is now a layer on top. You use the example of TripAdvisor, right?
Right.
And if you can answer to the critics in TripAdvisor, you have to pay TripAdvisor something. Can I...
Answer to the critics in TripAdvisor?
Right, exactly. So you have to, I think it's TripAdvisor, it's also Yelp. You, as the business, have to pay these companies some things to be able to actually answer negative feedback.
Oh, the answer, okay,
right,
yes,
feedback.
yes.
Is there a way, similar that you do the pronouns, is there a way, kind of one level up to actually check that the, reviews for one given place is truly natural and not manipulated by TripAdvisor such that they can make more money? Is there something that you could find out? Is there a pattern, underlying patterns or something? Is there a provenance kind of like thing of the validity of this is actually true feedback versus...
Yes, so I think that, again, this is a whole new, interesting line of research. More generally, there's a question of personalization. So it could be that you're not just asking the entire world for answers to particular questions. Mm-hmm. It might be there are people who fit Anna's profile better. Anna's profile being defined in any number of ways, from how she registers in the system to the questions that she's asked in the past, to the way that she's answered questions in the past. And you can imagine that you would want to tailor who you're asking in the crowd to the person asking the question and the type of question that they're asking. So I think this is sort of related, that again, if I look at an answer, thinking of it before it's been answered, if I look at something, I want to ask perhaps users like me, or I don't want the hotel to be telling me what they think of themselves. I want travelers like me, perhaps without children who don't want lots of children around, or with children who wants child-friendly things. So that's another layer that I think needs to be thought about, the personalization, and then I think that would fall out by looking at the provenance expressions and matching that against the personalization aspects. Great question, though. Yes?
I'm wondering about the ontology. So it looks like, from what you said, my impression is that the ontologies are trees of this. But in practice, they would be rather directed as cyclic graphs or something like this, because the central part is not only a part.
Right.
The example was not a tree, right?
The example was a tree with some additional annotations.
Well, that means it's not a tree.
Yeah, that's
It was just that is a tree, and then there were lots of other things that just had a different color. Right?
right. So what I'm alluding to is this most significant part. This was definitely based on the structure of the tree.
Yeah, so there's, as Christoph pointed out, there were really two different things. There were subclass and instance of, which would be tree-like, and then there would be these other inside over nearby, other relations that would connect the graph together. And so really the most significant is based on the instance of that part of it, not the other.
But this is not necessarily a tree
Yeah.
in practice.
Yeah, so you just want to know that there's nothing that you dominate. So I'll think about it offline, but I think as long as you can reason over that, there's nothing, you couldn't go further down something more specific. And if it's cyclic in an instance subclass of, I don't think that can be cyclic.
Cyclic is clearly not a case.
Right, so as long as it's acyclic, we're fine, right?
Okay.
There's most significant if it's acyclic.
I see.
So I've got a remark and a question.
Okay.
The remark first, could you maybe go back to the slide with this Denali review?
Yep.
Okay, this is for. No, that was the next one. No, the one with the reviews. We just passed by.
What?
The one with the reviews?
Oh, that one.
Yes, this one.
Yep.
I know who the first reviewer is. Do you?
You know the first reviewer?
Yes.
Oh, Renee.
No, it's not Renee. No, these are friends of it.
Friends of Renee. Speedy Vester. Who is it?
This must be Mohan.
Oh, then it's a useless review.
Because Mohan, he writes about everything on TripAdvisor. He was here in Lausanne. He wrote for every restaurant event. He wrote a TripAdvisor review. Okay. Anyway, so I've got.
Okay. Wow.
So maybe that's
I've
privacy
given this
questions
talk
here, right?
before, and it never occurred to me that I might know the person.
And of course, he would be friend with everybody, so it's clearly Mohan.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so my question. Now, I mean, all this provenance stuff is nice, but in this particular case, isn't this like a hammer in search of a nail? Because honestly, I mean, regarding spammers, I might know this before I ask the people, right? And if I don't, the provenance allows us potentially to speed up the correlation because we don't reevaluate, but you can cut these things away. And this might actually speed up things or not, right? Okay, this was
I'm not speeding things up.
because you don't have to reevaluate, right? I mean, what else do you get out of it? And actually, let me finish this because I'm actually making a suggestion here rather than just criticizing. I mean, I think you could do something really interesting with provenance potentially because, I mean, it would be potentially possible to actually find out how many distinct opinions there are and how much collusion there is and how much, people just are repeating what somebody else has said, right? Provenance could in principle track this, but you would have to know, I mean, people would have to willingly basically give the information about their provenance, where they have the information from. And you could ask this, they might lie, but it would be very hard for the entire crowd to lie consistently, right? So you could potentially find out how many distinct opinions there actually are. You could model this with provenance. And basically when you ask the question to the crowd, you could actually ask things that also would, in return, give you information to rebuild, so say, the provenance graph of the different people answering from the crowd, right? And that would really add something that you couldn't do otherwise.
Right. So the whole thing with spammer detection is you don't know at the time that they're a spammer necessarily, because you have to look at sort of a history. You know, so for example, you're giving the same response to everything. Yes, if it's a yes/no question. You won't know that you're a spammer until way down the road.
Right, but then I could revalidate the query, and that's what I save here. With
So if you've saved all of the answers, then you can go back and you can, yes, you can reevaluate and back your way out and come out. But in our case, it might be that we have to generate some additional questions to the crowd. Because it could be that we didn't get enough non-spammers in some of our answers, and that we've knocked out parts of the trees that we would now need to go back and reevaluate.
Okay, and I could also store this. Does the provenance
Right.
really allow us to do something I couldn't do otherwise, or does it just speed up the computational side of things?
So I think it speeds it up. I'm more interested in the generalization, the summarization that this is going to afford me, which I think, given the size of provenance, is the real issue. So yes, it'll speed it up.
No, what I don't get is, do you need it to be able to do it at all? Or is it just potentially speeding it up? I mean, suppose I just record the answers I get from all these questions I ask from humans.
Yes.
And I've got the query. Can I reevaluate, or do I really need the provenance to make sense of what I got and what I asked?
Well, if you're just recording the aggregate,
But suppose I don't, because that story is still smaller than the provenance, right?
Right.
Let's record all the answers we get. They were costly, you store them, no problem, right?
right?
Do we
So
need the provenance?
well, the provenance certainly isn't giving me anything more than I have if I record the answers to absolutely everything over time. So yes.
Well, it's not so clear to me, given what you said before, because you rightly said, based on what I got back, I might be triggered more questions. And ask those. So there's not just a single phase of questions, but there might be multiple phases, and they might be depending on what the answers were. And maybe to make these links, I need a provenance. But do I or do I not?
Well, I mean, you can always backtrack and start asking more questions, but you're right. This is, in some sense, it's an optimization, but you know, in our environment, it's a bit more complicated because of the line of questioning that we have going on.
I
So
still
let's
think
take.
it might be enhancing your confidence in the quality of the answer to have some links from.
Well, if you can just replay time, right?
Well, yeah, but then it's a matter of efficiency. Anyway, I have to.
She has to call
you know,
time.
I have to make sure that, speaking of time, that people can.
People can get out of here
So
before.
unless there's any more burning questions before we turn this into a meeting, which we will. How about we say thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.